Hello, and welcome to our podcast, Super Respectable. I'm David Lewis, based in the Netherlands, and with me is Tosh in Istanbul. Hey, Tosh.
How are you, Dave?
I'm doing all right. It's a pretty blustery, miserable day here, but just getting all packed and ready to go on holiday tomorrow. So looking forward to that. How are
That
you?
is right. That is right. I'm doing well. I wish I was going on holiday too, but you must be super excited. Huh? It's the first holiday in what, the whole year, all of 2020?
Yeah, I mean, I had some mini trips to the UK and Switzerland, but this is like a proper 2-week thing,
Yeah.
which is really exciting because it's warm weather in Italy, but also very stressing because of all the coronavirus stuff that we talked about in the last episode with Dr. Marcus.
Dr. Marcus, are you going to take some of his tips and advice to heart? Are you going to try to implement them on your trip?
Um, Well, the thing is, I really like sitting on the aisle seat
Yeah, me
on
too.
planes.
Me too.
So I know he said one of his big tips was to sit by the window because there's less chance of all the people passing by spreading stuff. But I think my enjoyment of the aisle seat and claustrophobia would outweigh the coronavirus fears on this occasion.
Yeah, for sure.
So
And what's like, without going into detail, because we don't want all our millions of listeners to stalk
yeah.
you on your trip. What's the itinerary? What's the schedule when you're in Italy? What are you gonna do? Where are you gonna go?
Yeah. So flying into Rome,
Nice.
spending a couple days there, and then we have a pretty long train journey from Rome to Venice, and then changing in Venice, and then heading into the mountains, into the Dolomites, to spend a week in the mountains in a very small village in the Dolomites, which is very picturesque and very beautiful. So
Okay.
we'll do a few days of hiking there, and then head back down to Venice and spend a week, maybe more, on the Lido or Lido. I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, but it's basically like the beach area of Venice, which is really nice. And um, it's where they have the Venice Film Festival and where George Clooney hangs out. So it's pretty cool.
Oh, if you see George, ask him if he wants to be on our podcast, you know?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot.
That's cool. Well,
So
I mean, I came back from holiday a month ago, and it was honestly the best mental break from everything. So I hope it's as beneficial for you guys as it was for us. But be safe, Dave, because we are still living in what is the apocalypse of the world. So like,
yeah, yeah. I mean, Italy has gone through a pretty tough time, as our listeners know, and the rest of the world observed. In March and April, it was pretty horrific what was going on there. So I think the population is pretty aware of the need to wear masks and distancing. I know it's not really culturally an Italian thing to keep distance because they like to hold each other and be close and do the kissing thing when they greet each other. So it'll be interesting to see if that's changed much since the pandemic.
yeah,
Um,
for sure. I
yeah.
mean, like, take pictures, and if there's any interesting stories you come across that follow in the theme of this podcast, take notes because we'd love to get a brief from you when you're back
Absolutely. Maybe I could do a reportage live on
live.
scene.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Look at that. Super
Very
respectable.
nice.
Going
Super
global.
respectable. For sure.
I think.
So,
Oh yeah, go on.
uh,
Sorry.
no, go ahead. I'd like to hear
I
your
was just
thoughts.
gonna say, wasn't last week amazing with Marcus? I mean, he did such an amazing job. I don't know about you, but I learned so much more than I'd known about COVID and coronavirus. And then we posted it online, and also because of the help with Marcus's networks, we got a lot of listening, a lot of listeners, and a lot of
Mm.
positive feedback. But it was a really good episode. So, Marcus, if you're listening, thank you again for being on, and we would love to have you back at any time. Thank you again.
Yeah, absolutely. I echo Tosh's comments. It was really awesome having you on the show, Marcus. And yeah, the time just flew by. I mean, I think it was over an hour long episode, but lost track of time because it was just really interesting and engaging conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also, possibly a subject of another super respectable episode is the fact that Marcus is the reason for the name super respectable of this
Yeah.
podcast.
So
So
that's a
maybe we can get
secondary
into
thing.
that another time.
For sure. So yeah, we'll get into that. It's an interesting story, but thank you, Marcus, for that as well. That's two thank yous from Dave and me. We really appreciate it. And then also, I just wanted to let people know that thanks to David Lewis, we are on social media as of this week. So we'll link up our Facebook and our Instagram and our YouTube and our Twitter page and our own URL. We got simplerespectable.com, which was amazing. So we are accessible by all means now on the World Wide Web.
Yeah, please. I'll post some links onto the different platforms. Please like, subscribe, do all the social medializing things that you're supposed to do to engage with our wonderful content.
Yeah.
And just one more thank you before we kick things off.
Okay.
And that's to Kentaro Ide one more time, because he came up with some more music for our podcast, and we're still deliberating as to where it fits best. So look out for some different music in the intro or outro or middle of the podcast.
Is that Italian?
Thanks again, Ken.
Is that the Italian you've been learning?
Yeah, exactly. I just made that up on the spot.
All right.
It sounds about right.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. All right, should we get into it? It's my week to present.
Yeah,
and,
it's your week. I'm excited.
Okay, so I'm going to be presenting something from the country of my birth, which is Japan. Just as a clarification, I'm not Japanese. My name is Japanese, Toshio, and the reason for that is that my mom and dad moved there when they got married, and they lived there for about 7 years, and I was born there, and they gave me a Japanese name. And they also gave both my sisters Japanese names, even though they were born in Canada. So it's just because of
Very
a love.
cool.
Yes, it's very cool. It's kind of an old story for me. I've been having to live with it for 34 years. But
it's not a burden. It's not a burden. It's
not
a very
burden,
wonderful
anyway.
thing.
But yeah. So my parents, very much love Japanese culture. I grew up there. I used to speak Japanese, Dave, but unfortunately, I don't speak it anymore. Maybe it's still in there. Yeah. When we moved to Canada, when I was 2. I had to learn English, and I think it took the place of Japanese. Though some people have said that it's still in there, you just need to open that door. You need to access it, and then it'll come out.
It's like riding a bicycle. It's always there once you've learned it, and just hop back on.
So okay, so let's start in Japan, the country of my birth, but not the country of my nationality. We're going to be talking about the Yakuza, Dave, in Japan.
Ooh.
Yeah, the Yakuza. Do you know anything about the Yakuza before we start? So I don't want to be repeating things that you know. Any knowledge, any experience, any membership involvement?
I will not disclose any possible memberships in any associations or societies, Mafia or otherwise.
Yeah, that's
good. But yes, I have some knowledge of the Yakuza. The main thing I know is it's the Japanese Mafia.
Yep.
It's also maybe it's just like a catch-all term. It's not like maybe one Yakuza. There's a bunch of them, possibly. And the other interesting thing, little tidbit that I know is tattoos. They're very well identified by the tattoos they wear. So when you go to the baths in Japan, they often say no tattoos allowed because they don't want Yakuza people bathing there. That's the extent of my Yakuza knowledge.
No, that's good. You got 3 for 3 there, so it's good. I'll touch on the tattoos and some other interesting practices they have. And so the reason I'm talking about the Yakuza is that I've always had a fascination with the Mafia, whether it's the Italian mob or the Chinese triads or the Japanese Yakuza. Something about it is very interesting to me. I love watching mob movies. I love reading books about the Mafia. I in no way support or endorse violence or what happens, but something about the way they operate and they get things done and their history is really fascinating to me. And every couple years, something about the Yakuza pops up in my mind again. And this actually just came up a few months back. And so I had written it down. And then when we started this podcast, I thought this would be a really interesting thing to present. So I will do so now. So,
Awesome.
as you mentioned, the Yakuza is an international organized crime syndicate which originated in Japan. I'm going to butcher the Japanese because it is my first language, but I've forgotten. But they actually don't go by the name Yakuza by different parties. The police and the media, they actually call them Boryu Kudan, which means violent group. And it's interesting, the police actually have told the media to call them this and not the Yakuza. So the police and the media follow in the same terminology. But the Yakuza themselves call themselves Ninkyo Dantai, which means shiverless organization. So how they see themselves very different, almost opposite from what the police call themselves. The Yakuza, which is the title I think I'll use in this presentation, they're known for their strict codes of conduct, which I'll go over, their organized nature in terms of how they operate, and the very unique, unconventional ritual practices, which we kind of touched upon. Historically, the Yakuza started in this 15th or 16th century.
Whoa.
Yeah,
Super old.
Super old, but they weren't the same Yakuza as we know today. There were two groups of people in society: the tekiya, who were pretty much individuals who sold illegal goods, and the bakuto, who were a group of people who were in gambling in the gambling world. And these two types of people kind of came together, and they were sort of the informal Yakuza. So they were sort of the misfits of society, the ones who were socially unaccepted, discriminated, and kind of in their own world. So these two groups kind of came together, and they created sort of a group known as the Yakuza, which were not violent at all, or the Mafia that we know today. So up until World War II, they didn't really have a lot of power. But what ended up happening was, after the war, Japan was devastated, right? So if you know your history, you know, major cities were in ruins. There was mass unemployment, starvation. The local police didn't have enough force or weren't effective in their work. And because of this, the black market started in Japan, and the Yakuza kind of found that opportunity to get in there and sell goods on the black market, really position themselves. A lot of veterans came back from the war and didn't really have jobs. So the Yakuza would take them in because they knew how to fight, right? Because of the war. So they took them in. So they started kind of creating this group. And by the time Japan's economy started to come back in the 50s and 60s, the Yakuza was already well positioned to be profitable from their illegal businesses, as well as having a huge membership as well. So it was really kind of that post-war era, which was devastating for everyone else, which was actually beneficial for the Yakuza to grow and to develop. So, so it's actually interesting. The way the Yakuza is structured is a traditional structure of a foster parent and foster child. So in Japanese culture, when an actual foster parent takes in a foster child, usually the father and the son share some sake, and this is a ritual that kind of indicates that the parent will take care of the child and the child the parent. And so how this is translated into the Yakuza is a lot of their membership are abandoned children, kids who have been kicked out of their homes, kids who are orphans, maybe kids who have run away from home, you know, the street thugs. And so a lot of them are really have nowhere to go. So a lot of the higher ups in the Yakuza have gone to this demographic and brought them in, and given them kind of a new life and a new chance. And because of this, they're seen as the foster parents, and the new initiatees, the kids, are seen as the foster children. So the family, as you know, it's a common term in mafia lingo. The family, there's usually a head of the Yakuza, and there's actually there's over 20 different groups of Yakuza, which I'll get into. But usually each group has a head, and then they have a group of people underneath them, and then another group of people, and they all kind of control different areas, just like a business. You know, you have your CEO, your chairman, and then your CFO, and then you know your managers and your assistant managers, et cetera, et cetera. But something that's really interesting is that when people join the Yakuza, if they come from, you know, they have to cut ties with their old family and transfer their loyalty to the gang boss. So, so you know, like I said, a lot of these kids, don't come from, like, don't have families. So for them, it's not really an issue. But for some of the individuals who actually join coming from a family, the Yakuza requires you to cut ties with your old family. So I don't know if this is a literal thing or it's more of a metaphorical thing, but regardless, your loyalty is no longer to your family; it's to your boss and to your foster father and to the group.
Mm.
So even in the Yakuza itself, the terminology they use in Japanese are fathers and brothers. An interesting point, by the way, is that the Yakuza is mostly male dominated. Apparently, the majority of Yakuza members are males. There are some females, but it's rare. It's usually the wives of kind of mafia, the bosses, the heads up. And actually, in one historical situation, when one of the bosses, I forgot the details. I read this though. When one of the bosses got murdered in one of the families, his wife took over as head of the family for a while. So that's interesting.
Mm.
So yeah. So okay, like I said, there's over 20 groups of Yakuza in Japan, but there's three major groups, the top three. The first one is called the Yamagachi Gumi. It's Japan's largest family. 30% of people who are in the Yakuza are in this family. It's HQ'd, headquartered in Kobe, Japan, which is famous for Kobe Bryant. No, that's a joke. I'm joking. It's famous
Kobe
for
beef.
Kobe beef. There you go. That they actually did not, for the longest time, expand into Tokyo, Japan's largest city. Though recently they have started going into it, and that has caused an issue with another family. They have a presence in Japan, in other parts of Asia, and America as well. The second group is the Sumiyoshikai, and they're actually really interesting. They function like a federation as opposed to kind of a hierarchy system. So it's very different from its rival groups. And so the chain of command is more relaxed. Their leadership is distributed as opposed to having one person at the top. So I guess more, it's more, everyone's got a voice in that family, which is
That's
also,
nice.
yeah, that's nice. And then the third group is the Inagawakai, and they're primarily based in Tokyo. So they didn't expand to other parts of the country, and they were actually one of the first syndicates to expand outside of Japan. So these are the top three, and then there are, I read, accounts of 21 other minor groups, but they're not as what do you say, powerful or influential as the top three.
Mm.
So you must be asking, Dave, the next question must be, what are their activities, right? What do they do? Like
What do they
what
get up to?
what are they up to? So while many of the Yakuza's sources of income are from conventional mafia practices, such as drug trafficking, racketeering, prostitution, uh, um, coercion, one
Mm.
thing that's actually really interesting I found is corporate blackmail. So they do this thing called sokaya, which means they become shareholders of publicly traded companies in Japan by buying shares. And when you buy shares, you have a right to attend the annual shareholder meetings. And what they do is they come to these meetings and they threaten to reveal sensitive information about the company's practices or their employees or finances unless they get a bribe, unless they get paid off. So, in other parts of the world, most publicly traded overseas companies are obliged to release annual reports, right? In Canada being one of them.
Mm-hmm.
In Japan, based on Japanese law, these companies actually don't need to issue any such reports. And so, what's interesting about this is in Japan, public perception is very, very important. So, whether you're actually doing something wrong or you're perceived to be doing something wrong, it's almost the same. And so, because of this, the Yakuza have found a way to use that cultural practice for their benefit. So
Well, in a
they,
way, it's very noble. I mean, they're enforcing corporate governance standards that are recognized around the world
yeah,
in Japan.
yeah.
So in that respect, I would say, well done.
Yeah, so it's like it's our version of corporate social responsibility in Japan, right?
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. They go. Can you imagine being in a shareholders meeting and having like a bunch of Yakuza guys show up, and then like you'd be terrified, right? So it's clearly effective, right, in
It
terms
would
of what they want to.
improve my transparency and accountability immeasurably.
Yeah, of course. So they do that. There's a bunch of legitimate businesses they invest in as well. Department stores, little mom and pop stores. They buy stock in major companies as well legally. Here's an interesting fact: is that even though they do sell drugs, their members are not allowed to use drugs. So there's a prohibition on drug usage inside the organization.
That's very
Uh,
smart as well.
Very good. Theft, actual stealing of stuff is not allowed. They want their activities to remain semi-open. And the reason theft is not allowed is because such an act is considered to be trespassing of the community, which they want to be in good standing of. So they don't
Mm,
steal. So this number has not been verified, but on one report, as per the U.S. State Department and the Treasury, the entire Yakuza system, they say, is worth up to $80 billion US.
wow.
Yeah, and the top group, the Yamaguchi Gumi, they say they're worth about 6.6 billion USD from their work. So it's really interesting. And then I was looking at kind of if the Yakuza are primarily in Japan or if they have global reach. So in the States, they do have a presence in a lot of different states, but two in particular. Do you want to guess which two?
Yeah, I'll try.
Okay,
Hawaii,
correct.
and well, another West Coast one,
Correct.
California.
Two for two, Dave. 100%. Good for you. So in Hawaii, there's a lot of drug trade as well as buying firearms that were built in America and shipping them to Japan. And the reason they're in Hawaii is because there's a strong Japanese population, so they blend in, right? And they have good links there. And I guess
Mm,
geographically, it's also sort of close both to Japan and to mainland America. And then in California, they have a good positioning, not only because there's a strong Japanese community there, but they also work with other mafia groups, such as the Chinese triads or the Korean mafias. So they actually outsource some of their work to some of the other mafia groups. So,
wow.
so I guess there's like collaboration there, you know. So it's interesting. And then in Southeast Asia, they have a strong presence because it's close to Japan. Whether it's drugs or arms trade, they actually have presence in a number of countries, and they've even been arrested and imprisoned in multiple countries. I read about a drug trade that went bad in the Philippines, and a Yakuza boss was stuck in jail there. I forget for how long, but
Hmm.
yeah, it's interesting. So the Japanese media says that at the height of the Yakuza in the 1960s, it's kind of gone down now. There was over 200,000 Yakuza around the world, but this number has drastically dropped. There are other opportunities for young people now, so they don't really go towards this organization. And also, the Japanese government has started to discourage the growth of Yakuza membership. So the number that I got was, at the moment, as of 2019, it's about 28,200 active members in the Yakuza group, but still one of the largest international organized crime syndicates in the world. So
Yeah, still pretty sizable.
sizable, yeah, yeah, definitely. Here's some interesting. I have a couple interesting facts which I'll get to, but this is the last thing I want to say before that. Is so I was wondering how, because in the movies that I watch, there's like a romanticism with the mafia. You know what I mean? If you watch The
Yeah.
Godfather, like you don't really feel bad for other people, you know, because they seem to be doing good things. So I was wondering what the Japanese population perceived the Yakuza as. So apparently, in the 90s, there was a big earthquake in Japan, as well as, do you remember the 2011 tsunami in
For
Japan?
sure.
The Japanese government was very slow to respond to both calamities, and the Yakuza actually responded faster to it by delivering food, water, blankets, and toiletries to a number of emergency centers in Northeast Japan before the government did. So this really put them in good light, you know, in the face of the public. Um, um, uh, the the Yakuza sort of have an image that they help the weak and they steal from the rich, a sort of Robin Hood mentality. So in some people's eyes, they're seen more favorably than others. Interestingly, the Yakuza in itself, it's are not illegal in Japan. It's
Really?
not. Yeah, it's interesting. They even have clearly labeled offices, business cards. You can publicly say that you're part of the Yakuza. It's not illegal to be part of that organization. And so the reason the Japanese government does this is because if they made them illegal outright, it would drive them to the underground market, right, where they wouldn't be able to control their activities to the level they are now. It would also disturb national dominance and incite more violence from other neighboring mafias. So in Japan, the Russian Brava exist, as well as the Chinese triads. So having the Japanese Yakuza be legal kind of puts the other mafias in check in society. I don't know if that
Oh,
makes sense.
interesting.
Yeah,
It's a very unusual, unorthodox approach, but I
yeah,
guess it has its logic.
it is. Yeah, it's really interesting. It's very counter intuitive to what's happening in other parts of the world. For example, I know in the States, being in the mafia is clearly illegal, such as their activities, but the Japanese have taken a different approach. And I think the mafia, the Japanese Yakuza, they're not in cahoots with the government, though there are certain politicians that they buy off and they use them as lobbyists, for their own needs.
Hmm.
But generally, sometimes the government may, I think, if the Yakuza can assist the government in anything that also benefits them, then they do, because it's legal to do so, right? It's not illegal to exist. And then at the same time, the Japanese government sees the Yakuza as putting a check to other violence and gangs. So I guess they're outsourcing violence then, you know what I mean? As opposed to maybe their police force cannot manage it, or their military can't manage it to the level they need. And the Yakuza is so strong, so it's better to have them sort of be a technical ally as opposed to as opposed to being an enemy.
Right. I see.
So it's interesting, right? Like it's a very interesting concept. So yeah, okay. Let me discuss some of the really interesting facts I found of it. Some consider the Yakuza to be the true heirs of the samurai. And the reason they justify this is that they say that both groups are organized into strong hierarchical systems based on honor and subservience. Both see violence as a way to get things done, and both have a strong sense of tradition and pride.
Hmm.
So I remember this from my time in Japan, and then also growing up, that respect and honor are a really big part of Japanese culture and Japanese tradition. And so the Yakuza implement that in their day-to-day work, even though some of the work that they do is clearly violent or illegal. They still try to have honor in the way that they operate, and the samurai sort of did the same. The Yakuza's code of honor, which is called Ninkyo, it reportedly values justice and duty above anything else, and it forbids allowing others to suffer. But this last part, I was sort of kind of having questions on, because like when you do drug trafficking, when you do sex trafficking, when you sell arms, clearly there is somebody suffering in the process of it. So I wonder if it's like the average everyday person that they're talking about, or they're talking about their own membership. But you know what
Yeah,
I
that's an
mean?
unusual element of their codes. I would
Yeah,
say they're not exactly the most
yeah. It's
best position to be preachy and moralistic.
I guess, yeah, it's interesting. I guess that, like, have you ever been to Japan?
I have not, sadly.
I'd love. I haven't gone since
Have you?
I left. Since
You haven't
we
been
like,
back since you left?
yeah, it's been since
Oh,
1987. I'd love to go. Take my wife and go. Japanese culture has been really fascinating to me, because they're very, very family oriented, culturally inward focused, in the sense that they like their own culture, and they like to kind of adhere to it. So I'm wondering how much of that kind of translates when you get into an organization. So maybe it'd be interesting to see how they've incorporated those aspects of life, you know?
I'm just looking up the Wikipedia page, of course, on
Yeah,
the Yakuza as you were
yeah.
speaking, and it's describing about some of their interesting rituals, which
I'm gonna get
um,
to that. Oh,
I think
please.
with there's. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, no,
Yeah, I
no.
figured it wouldn't be good for me to intervene
It's,
in
no, no,
into your
no. Save your
presentation.
questions, because this is the highlight of the talk, because it's amazing. Like, if you got questions, write them down, because I was so fascinated with this. I have two more points and then I'll get to it. But I was gonna end it off with a firework, with a bang. So here's some interesting facts. Sumo wrestling is a big part of Japanese culture. Whenever there are big sumo wrestling events, usually the audience is rife with Yakuza members.
Really?
They'd like to go to the sumo matches. Here's another interesting one. Did you ever play Super Nintendo back in the
Of
90s?
Of course.
So as we know, Nintendo is a Japanese company. In 1990, when Super Nintendo came out, the Japanese government had to ship them at night because they thought that if they did it during the day, the cargo vans would be hijacked by the Yakuza. So the Japanese government had to take extra precautions. If you join one of the families, the Yamaguchi-gumi, there is actually a written test that's 12 pages long that you need to pass. You know, it talks about, you know, knowledge of gangster lore and rules. So that's interesting. They have their own magazine that they publish, one of the families, and they talk about issues such as fishing, haiku poetry, and they even encourage the readers to do good as well. So
That's nice.
yeah, I'd love to see a magazine, even if I didn't know how to read it. I'd like to kind of see how it goes. So here's the highlight. Here's the thing. Here's the unusual cultural practices. Okay, so in the Yakuza culture, punishment is usually given out in the Yakuza through some form of violence. And the most common of which is known as yubizume. And if you fail to complete a task or you've done something to dishonor the family, you engage in yubizume, which is the amputation of a part of your little finger. So what happens is the offender will, without any assistance from anyone else, will go in front of the boss, and everyone will, the rest of the family or members of the family will be there witnessing. They'll use a sharp knife and they will cut off the finger, that tip, without using any sedatives. They'll take the tip of the finger, wrap it in a cloth, and present it to the boss or to their superior as a sign of an apology. If you commit other offenses, it might result in the amputation of other fingers or your other little finger. So the reason they do this is because in ancient times, if you didn't have that tip of your little finger, it prevented you from holding swords properly for fighting. Swords are like katanas, Japanese swords. And this is actually really clever. I mean, I'm not promoting it, but the reason, and if you couldn't hold a sword, you'd be handicapped in a fight, right? You wouldn't have full mobility. And in turn, this would require your dependence on the Yakuza for protection in future battles. So it's
very smart.
Yeah, it's very, very smart. So what a lot of Yakuza do now is, like, you'll see pictures online. A lot of guys are missing fingers. They actually wear prosthetics so they can kind of they can kind of integrate into society. Because if people see you without fingers, they know you're part of the Yakuza, and the police will clearly know, and it'll become an issue. So I don't know if this practice still continues, but I do know that a lot of people wear prosthetics. And if you want to see it in fiction, go on. I'll post the YouTube video online. There's a movie called The Outsider with Jared Leto, and he's part of the Yakuza, and he's done something bad, and he actually has to cut off 2 of his fingers in front of his boss in the same run, the same go. And it's I can only imagine if you don't faint or whatnot, and then you have no fingers anymore, you know. So interesting.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of the pictures of Yubitsume. It does not look very nice.
It's I don't know. And okay, and then the second practice, which you made mention to, are the tattoos, which are very kind of very much linked to the Yakuza. So the tattoos in the old traditional way is called irizume. So it's actually interesting. 300 years ago, tattoos were used to identify criminals. So this practice has sort of kind of continued up until the modern day. And so now tattoos are used to recognize members in the Yakuza. It's also used to demonstrate commitment and boast about the wealth that specific member may have. So in the old way of doing it, so which some people do still, it's an extremely painful process. This is the process of irizume, in which the tattoos are hand poked. They go under the skin and they go. It's not using a machine. It's very traditional minded, and it's really painful. But if you can endure the pain, it sends a message of your commitment to the lifestyle and permanent rejection of mainstream society. And
no thanks.
Yeah, you guys should definitely, if you go online, check out some of the tattoos, because I don't have any tattoos. I don't know, Dave, if you have any tattoos or not.
Nope.
I'm not really interested in it, but I'm always fascinated at the intricacy of tattoo doing on people, and the Japanese ones are very detailed, like very, very intricate. Like from an artistic point of view, it's really fascinating that someone was able to do it on a body. And so a lot of the
And
designs
they're
are
full body.
full body. You see a lot of old guys with tattoos too, if you go on Google as well, like old Yakuza members. And so a lot of the tattoos are based on Japanese mythology. So there's a lot of dragons and samurais and koi fish because they represent wealth, honor, prosperity. So it's really interesting. And then this is kind of a disturbing part. Sometimes, it doesn't happen often, but sometimes the tattoo skins are peeled off of dead corpses and sold on the black
Oh,
market, and they're displayed in art galleries because of how intricate the art is.
oh,
So
come on.
it's a really interesting lifestyle for it. And yeah, so this is the Yakuza, and I'll end with one last fact, and then if you have any questions, or I have some questions for you too, we can kind of go between each other.
Sure.
So the name Yakuza actually originates from a traditional Japanese card game called Ochukabu. And so the game, the objective of the game is to draw 3 cards. In an optimal situation, you want 3 cards to add up to a score of 9. So if the sum of the cards exceeds 10, you use the second digit as the score instead. And if the sum is exactly 10, the score is 1. So I'll link it online, don't worry. But if the 3 cards drawn are an 8, a 9, and a 3, which is converted into the word Yakuza, the sum is 20, and therefore the score is 0, making it the worst possible hand that can be drawn. And because of that, the Yakuza have taken on their name.
Interesting.
Very fascinating, huh? Yeah. What do you think? Like general thoughts. What's
I mean, I'm like you in many ways. I find these kind of global international gangs, crime syndicates fascinating. I wouldn't want to be near them by any stretch of the imagination, but I just like being an observer from afar.
yeah.
And it's just interesting to me how there's a lot of parallels between, the Japanese Yakuza, the Italian Mafia, the Russian Mafia, the Hells Angels. I mean, between the rituals, the tattoos, the way it's structured, obviously the types of crimes they get up to, the codes they have. But it made me think, like, who would win? Who would win? Like if you had some sort of like epic battle or had them all in one territory.
Yeah.
Who would be more powerful? Like the Italian Mafia is the one everyone knows. It's the
Well, I think the reason is that in Hollywood, because there's more of a presence of the Italian American
sure.
diaspora. I think they've been represented. I mean, quote unquote, more in Hollywood literature and Hollywood art. So I think they come off as a lot. I mean, like my favorite movie is The Godfather, and I watch it at least once a year. And it's one of those things my dad and I used to do together, and I love the movie. And I think anything in life can be connected to The Godfather. In no way, again, do I support the violence, but there's a lot of aspects to their lifestyle that I find very noble and respectful. But there's many things that I don't as well. But I spoke to you a few months back about a series on Netflix called Hajigiri. People, our listeners, if you want to see a really interesting series on the Mafia, on the Japanese Yakuza, it's about the Japanese Yakuza in London, like between the two worlds. And
Giri Haji.
There you go. Giri Haji, check it out. It's really interesting. Yeah, I agree with you. I wouldn't want to be a part of it in any way, shape, or form, but something about it is very, very luring, like as from an academic point of view. And I think, what I think it is that I've heard other people talk about it. I think the Mafia, they get things done that other forms or other entities don't, So like, just like in that example where after the earthquake in Japan or the tsunami, the government was very slow to respond because of bureaucracy and money and politics. The Yakuza were sort of like, we need to help people and we have the capability to do it. Let's just do it. And I think that really comes off in good light in the public's perception.
Yeah, I mean, Pablo Escobar was well known for funding the local soccer team and having a zoo or all sorts of charitable endeavors while he was blowing up planes and doing all sorts of stuff. So the charitable aspect is definitely a key component. You have to have CSR, corporate social responsibility, if you're running any kind of competent crime group.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I guess it's giving to the masses, and not only for charity, but also I'm sure there's a selfish reason too, right? You want
Mm.
the community on your side as well. And I think even in the States, like even in Godfather 1 and 2, the community, Godfather 3 is debatable, people. We can debate that on another day, but
Yeah.
but even the community had the Godfather and his family in very high view, right? Because of they took care of their own. They took care of people that other people didn't want to, right? They even took people. Even one of the Don Corleone's sons is adopted, right? Robert
Hmm.
Duvall. So he took him in and he raised him. And I think it's strange, right? In life, whenever you see bad people do good things, and you sort of kind of it plays with your mind a little, right? Like if you've already kind of they do this bad thing, and then you think of that like that's what they are, but then suddenly they do one good thing, and then your mind starts kind of shifting on it, like you know what I mean? Like it's really strange to put them in a category.
Well, the thing is, that, like you mentioned, how the Yakuza take in, you know, they
Orphans,
adopt
yeah,
the orphan children, they adopt. So it's in a way a noble act, but it's also corrupting them beyond all measure. So uh, it's in a way these different crime groups. The Italian mafia originates from Sicily, right? One of the most
right,
impoverished parts of Italy.
yeah,
So they kind of arise in an area where there's not much government presence, or they step in where there's a vacuum. In instances where the Japanese government was slow to respond to like a national crisis, like the tsunami or the
yeah,
earthquake, the Yakuza made sure they were there right on the spot
right
to
on it,
show that they could handle things the government couldn't.
yeah,
Um, so in a way, they can should be a reflection on the governance of that society. And it kind of made me think, because all these crime groups, they generally get up to the same things: drug
totally,
sales, prostitution, racketeering.
yeah,
um, and we're both from Canada.
yeah,
One of the big things that's happened in the last few years in Canada is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made marijuana legal,
yes,
right?
yeah,
And one of the big arguments of doing that is to, diminish the crime aspect.
yeah,
So you can go to a store, it's like a Starbucks, it's all clean. You
yeah,
spend some money, you know who you're buying from, you know the product,
yeah,
and there's not necessarily, I hope, a risk of any kind of danger to you.
yeah,
But these crime groups are also showing up in places where those kind of rules are suppressed. The U.S. has had a war on drugs for forever,
right,
and the Mexican cartels are as strong as they've ever been. So my kind of thinking is, should the governments try to be super liberal and follow this Canadian government or Dutch government thing? Make prostitution legal,
right.
make certain drugs legal, and then that thereby reducing the violent nature of these organized crime groups and their presence in these societies.
Yeah,
Like, what's your take on that?
I uh, I think there's always going to be uh, um, uh, a disparity between the government and these organized groups, because they're just in. There are commonalities between them, of course, but I think for the most part they're in opposing views. I've always seen the mafia or gangs or mobsters in the sense that they just get things done that the government can't, right? And
Hmm.
at the end of the day, they're an entity that is a business, right? Like they're making money through multiple streams. And so, I mean, in the situation of Canada, I'm sure that they were in the drug business before marijuana was legalized, and now that it's legalized, maybe they've shifted to other drugs, right? So, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe they've kind of refocused their business model, quote unquote. So, like, I think they'll adapt and they'll keep going. But I mean, yeah, it's a tough call. Like I'm not promoting any form of it whatsoever, just from a neutral point of view. Like, I think in Canada, like the legalization of marijuana had many factors in it, right?
For sure.
So yeah, I'm not sure exactly for it. I mean, if I was a politician and it was me against, like, if I knew that a decision I was going to make could incite potential problems from the mafia, like how would I interact? Like, I'm not sure, like it's definitely a concern. For example, in Canada, I think most of the mob, the Italian mob, is based out of Montreal, from
Hmm.
what I know. So they have a strong suit there, and they operate regardless of what happens. And I'm sure they have more loyalty and more sway in their communities than any MP could, right? Because they're on that local ground level. And it's the same with the Yakuza. The way the hierarchy is built is that the top guy, he's there, but his generals and his lieutenants and his colonels, they're in the communities and they're helping the people as well, right? So I think in the light of everyday people, they might be seen in a better
Yeah,
view
because
than others.
people have a dim view of politicians in most countries. So,
Yeah.
in some ways, people would ironically side with the gangsters, and since they have such a, you know, benevolent way of dealing with their local communities,
Yeah.
then yeah.
Absolutely. Let me ask you a question. So I've had this discussion with my wife multiple times because I love gangster movies, and I always tell her, like, I wish I was a gangster, and just as a joke, and like when I watch the movies and stuff. But like there are some things that gangsters do that don't bother me, and there's some things that gangsters do that do bother me. And let me add some context to this. Even in Godfather One, if you remember the movie or not, this was in the 50s, the 60s. It's set in. Um, um,
Hmm.
um, uh, a new mobster came to Don Corleone, the Godfather, and he wanted to bring drugs into New York, and he wanted the Godfather to know if they would partner together and he could distribute their drugs. So already his family was in the alcohol business, in the racketeering business, in the coercion business, in bribery as well. But in the end, he decided he did not want to get into drugs because of the negative effects it has on people, right? So this kind of goes back, like, it makes him feel he's a very honorable, moral person, I guess, in this sense. So, and it's because of that decision that he gets shot and ultimately hospitalized for it. In your view, do you feel like, well, you don't have to go into specifics, but do you feel that you can categorize some of the activities as like acceptable and others as non-acceptable of the mafia?
uh,
Necessary evils, if it makes it easier to answer.
Yeah, I just think a bit like what I was saying earlier. They're fulfilling on the good side areas where the government is missing or lacking. So they're providing, a service to their local community, which um, whatever government may not have done otherwise. So in that respect, it's good, and
Yeah,
they earn, but the way they earn their money to fund those kind of things is obviously bad.
yeah,
So, um, yeah, I just think it's a reflection and a failing of the government and a society in some way. So, I think there's definitely the good they can do can be incorporated into, you know, a community group, a volunteer group, a competent local member of parliament's constituency association. You
yeah.
know, I mean, any one of those good activities that a yakuza or mafia gets involved with,
Yeah.
you could cut those out and then tackle all the nasty stuff.
Well, an interesting point you made there is that there's another great show on Netflix called Peaky Blinders, right? It's
Oh
about,
yeah, great
yeah, of
show.
course, a great, fantastic show. You guys check it out. It's amazing. It's about the mob, the mafia, the English mafia in Birmingham. And actually, as the seasons go through, they follow in the same path that most mafia people do, in that they get wealthy, but they also take care of their community. And their head, their leader, actually becomes an MP, right? As you've suggested. And but what he does is that he still continues to help his constituents, but he uses his position to benefit himself as well. Giving bribes, taking bribes, really kind of guaranteeing his position, and then he keeps getting elected over and over again. So I wonder if, in reality, if the mafia did enter politics legally, if they would use that position to continue in their illegal works.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, that would be a really troubling step if they start getting to the stage of entering various elected bodies of governing, levels of government. That would just sort of mean your country's on the rocky road, the slippery slope of being taken over by a criminal group or the mafia.
Yeah.
So even if you had a token one MP,
Yeah.
like the Mr. Peaky Blinder,
Yeah.
that's more than one too many, you know.
Yeah. To any mafia members listening, I am pro mafia. Dave is anti mafia, so him you need to get on me.
There goes your future political career.
So it's really a fascinating issue. I mean, like I said, if you watch The Godfather 1 or 2, or Casino, or Goodfellas, or recently Scorsese's movie The Irishman, it's there's something about it that's very, very alluring. I can definitely get it, and something about it that makes you just kind of sympathize with them, right? I don't know what it is. It's fascinating, but of course, at the end of the day, you know, the actions that they take are not justified, are never justified. But the stories and their way of operation, including the Yakuza, interesting, right? Very, very interesting.
Yeah, but I guess the hard thing is like these people, they just kind of grow up. Some people are born into these families, and that's all they know.
That's true.
And
Yeah.
it's really hard for them to get out of it once they're in it. And it's interesting that the Japanese angle of the Yakuza, because I don't know as much about that as I do about the Italian mafia and more Western crime groups. And yeah, it's like you said, they have storefronts and shops and memberships, from what you say.
Yeah.
So can you just walk into a Yakuza shop and say, hey, I'd like to get one of your 1 year memberships, 2 years for half price sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's not illegal, the Yakuza. It's not illegal to be part of the Yakuza. The Yakuza in itself is not illegal, and people on their business cards I mean, it doesn't say Yakuza, but like clearly they know it's Yakuza, and they have office buildings. So you could clearly walk into a Yakuza store for sure. But I mean, if I ever went into like a Yakuza department store, I would just buy what I had to buy and then get out. I wouldn't engage in anything because I had that sense. There'd be something on my shoulders the whole time, like looking over my shoulder, that sense of kind of anxiousness. But but if my interpretation of things are correct, is that if you don't interact with them and cause any problems, they won't interact with you or cause any problems, right? Like that's generally what I have. But where that goes out the window is trafficking. Some of the stuff I read around human and sex trafficking is really, really disturbing, and that's where the idea of not making sure the public is safe and they don't get involved. That's sort of where it goes out the window, right? Because like these people didn't really do anything wrong, but they're being used for horrendous acts. So I mean, sure. I'm going to keep looking into it and researching and seeing how it operates. But there is one area of I guess hypocrisy that I see. So yeah. Okay, before we end, I will tell you my family's story relating to the Yakuza. And
oh, really?
It's
your family story relating to the Yakuza.
Yeah. So as you know, my mother and father lived in Japan for 7 years. So they speak Japanese fluently. They know Japanese culture. When I was 2, they moved to Vancouver, Canada, which is my hometown. And for a while, when my dad got there, because he knew Japanese and he had a really good relationship with the Japanese community, he acted as a tour guide for Japanese tourists, for a Japanese company, and he used to show people around Alberta and BC. So one day, a man came on the tour with them, and my dad saw him, and it was very, very familiar looking, but he didn't know who he was. But he built a friendship with my dad. This note on Japanese people is they get really, really excited if non-Japanese people speak Japanese and know their culture. They find it very appreciative. So anytime we go to a Japanese restaurant, I always get my mom to speak Japanese, and they love it. Like everyone loves it. And we get
awesome.
free California rolls and stuff like that, So so this guy came on a tour with his family, and my dad made really good friends with him. And he really liked my dad and really was an older gentleman. And then he told my dad eventually that like he wanted to invest in and buy a house in Vancouver and just kind of keep it as an investment. and if my dad could help him with that, because my dad was from the city and he knew the property. This was like early '90s, man. So my dad, they bought a house, and it was empty for a long time. And so my dad asked the guy if we could live in the house and pay him rent. And this man was generous of it. Of course, no problem. You don't have to pay rent, but of course my parents did. At least someone would be like a caretaker of the home, in
Hmm.
addition to us having a roof over our heads. So we do it, and eventually my dad finds out who the gentleman is, and because he always appears in the newspapers in Japan. He's a high-ranking member of the Yakuza.
No
Uh,
way.
yeah, but we wouldn't have known it otherwise. There's pictures of me and him. I was a baby, so like him and his wife adored me a lot. I was told. I have no memory of this, but my dad was really good, and so from time to time he would come to Vancouver, check on the house, talk with my dad. But for the most part, we would just sign checks and pay rent into an account or whatever it was. One day, though, the guy dies. He's in his old age, but he is assassinated in Japan. So
Really?
yeah, and so my dad gets the news here, and apparently what had happened was the guy, or months earlier, the guy had found out that he had cancer, right? And it was very it's like stage 4, very serious, and he didn't want to go out that way. So this is very Yakuza of the story. He paid a hitman to kill him and take him out of his misery at any given time without letting him know when it would be. It would be like a random act, right? So,
No way.
he didn't want to suffer. He didn't want to die slowly. So he paid a guy to come in. And so one day when he was at a cafe having his morning coffee, a guy came in, pulled out a gun, shot him in the head, killed him. And afterwards, it's revealed, his publicly that his links to the Yakuza. He was a very high-standing Yakuza member too, so stuff like that. And then my dad, eventually, his wife reached out to my dad to let him know our condolences. He was a really nice man to us. We had no issue. And so by that time, my parents were a little bit more established in Vancouver. It had been a while, so they actually offered the wife the opportunity for us to buy the house from them, right? Because we had been already living there, and my dad had enough money, and the wife accepted, and we bought the house. This is where things get interesting. Is later on, as life went on, my mom would say that she'd see big tour buses driving by our house like all the time.
Oh
And
no.
it was really strange because you've been to my house. I live kind of in like I don't really live on a public road or in downtown or anything. I kind of live in a little community, and it's like it's very strange. It's very suburbianish. But these tour buses would be coming, and people would be taking pictures of our house, right? And so
Your house, the house I've been to is the Yakuza house.
so it's not the house that we went to. It was the house we renovated in about 20 years back. It was the older version of the
Ah,
house. So
okay.
apparently what had happened, my mom one day went down, got the name of one of the tour buses, and she didn't know what was happening because it was years later, right? It was just strange. So she got the name of the tour bus, and she went down to the center, and she kind of like informally asked, like, what's going on? Like, there's people coming by my house and blah, blah, blah. And they mentioned that this is the house of, a high ranking Yakuza member who had a house in Vancouver. And so it was in the newspaper. We have a clipping at home. This was like mid '90s, and so
Hmm.
it went on for a while, and eventually it started dying off. It didn't become as interesting of a tourist attraction, and then we never talked about it. I was only told of this kind of like 10 years ago when one day I was looking through our storage, like photos, and this came up, and I read the article, and I asked my mom, and she talked about it, and she was like, yeah, this happened. And so here's the kicker is that earlier this year I was watching the Netflix show Giri Haji
Hmm.
in it, and I got really interested, and it reminded me of the story. So then I started just Googling a little bit. I wanted to know what the name of the guy was and stuff. And a gentleman in the States had wrote a book on the Yakuza, and he actually mentions this story in his book on page blah 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 blah, which I have a copy of for it. And so
No way.
it's been verified. Some of the information is incorrect in that book. I even thought about reaching out to the author to let him know, but in the end, I just let it go because it's been such a long time. But it's been verified, and it talks about it, and there's a whole page on it too. So that's our story of the Yakuza and our family. And so I have no memory of it whatsoever, but from what I'm told, we had a very good relationship. We weren't in anyone's bad lights, and I was adored very much by this Yakuza gentleman. and he was very nice to my parents as well, and he really helped them when they first settled in Canada, and they kind of started building a life together. What an amazing story, huh, Dave?
That is absolutely mind-blowing, and I definitely see the reason for telling the story of the Yakuza. It's wow, it's quite the connection.
Anyways, that's my presentation. I hope you found it interesting or fascinating. I really find this issue very, very captivating, and I'm gonna keep researching it and watching films and reading and stuff. And so yeah, that's the Yakuza in Japan.
Well, thanks, Tosh. I found it both interesting and fascinating. That wraps it up for this edition of Super Respectable.
There you go, super respectable. Anyways, Dave, I hope you have safe travels. We will continue with our podcast as usual, and I'll see you next time, mate.
Yeah, catch you next time, Tosh.